I have frequently said that Black Lives Matter has done a great deal of damage to the very black lives that they claim to matter. This is a prime example. There's a man who works for a news conglomerate called Thomson Reuters. Thomson Reuters hired him as a data scientist, not as a reporter, a data scientist. And he posted a long critique of Black Lives Matter where he documented how many people are dead as a result of the Ferguson effect, or more recently, the George Floyd effect. So when he posted it, Human Resources calls him in and asks him to reform his thoughts. He refused. He got fired. Let's go over the paper by Mr. Zac Kriegman. Headline is real simple. BLM spreads falsehoods that have led to the murders of thousands of black people in the most disadvantaged communities. We're going to go over critical parts of his essay. Quote, he says, I believe the Black Lives Matter movement arose out of a passionate desire to protect black people from racism. So he's okay with it. He said he followed the research, the movements, what's been going on, how the news media have been covering Black Lives Matter. And he said this, and I quote, it's led me to the conclusion that the claim at the heart of the movement, that the police more readily shoot black people, is false and likely responsible for thousands of black people being murdered in the most disadvantaged communities of the country, end of quote.
I know people get tired of hearing me say it, but we are scared as black people in America. Black men, black women, black kids, we are terrified because you don't know. You have no idea. You have no idea how that cop that day left the house. You don't know if he woke up on the good side of the bed. You don't know if he woke up on the wrong side of the bed. You don't know if he had an argument at home with a significant other. You know, if one of his kids said something crazy to him and he left the house steaming. Or maybe he just left the house saying that today is going to be the end for one of these black people.
Think about this. Black Lives Matter is causing black people to be killed because the police are pulling back. In the essay, and we'll get to that, he calls it the Ferguson effect. More recently, people are calling it the George Floyd effect. It is getting people murdered. Mr. Kriegman continues. He criticizes organizations, including his own, to cover the Black Lives Matter movement properly. Quote, there seems to be a nearly absolute failure to examine the scholarly research coming out of the most respected institutions in our country, which demonstrates the acute damage the BLM movement is doing to many black communities. He takes his own organization to task. Thomson Reuters, he says, must do better. Quote, at BLM protests and from BLM proponents, we've heard that it is open season for police to kill black people, that the police are hunting black people. According to the BLM website, quote, black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise by state-sanctioned violence against black people, end of quote. Now think about that. Black Lives Matter says the police are targeting black people to kill them. What is their basis for saying this? What do the data say? Back to the essay. Then he talks about the Washington Post database of police shootings. Over the last 5 years, he writes, there have been typically between 30 to 100% more unarmed whites killed by police than unarmed blacks, with an average across the last 5 years of 39%. Take 2020, he says. There were 457 whites shot and killed by police compared to 243 blacks. Of those, 24 whites killed were unarmed compared to 18 blacks. So the cops kill more unarmed whites than they kill unarmed blacks. I bet you most people couldn't name one. He also points out that the vast majority of those suspects being shot and killed by the police were resisting arrest in an armed or threatening way. He points out the police are not supposed to distribute their forced manpower in an equitable way. They put them where the crime is. You fish where the ducks are. He talks about that. On average, he writes, violent crime rates are dramatically higher in predominantly black communities than they are in predominantly white communities. Duh! That's why the cops are there. And he writes, quote, because on average, there is so much greater violence in predominantly black neighborhoods, in order to protect and defend the mostly black residents who are law-abiding in those communities, police are disproportionately required to confront criminal suspects in those communities. In other words, the greater the crime, the greater the likelihood the cops are going to be there, the greater the likelihood the cops are going to have an interaction with a suspect who happens to be black. This is not rocket science. And he writes, there is a substantial body of evidence that different racial groups resist arrest at different rates. In other words, black people are also more likely to resist arrest. Again, this accounts for a greater instance in which black people are going to be harmed by the police. Now let's talk about disproportionate rates of crime. Quote, here the evidence is very clear, he writes. For instance, the Wall Street Journal reports that African Americans make up 53% of known homicide offenders in the U.S. and commit about 60% of the robberies, though they are just 13% of the population. As for non-homicide violent crime, the Justice Department's National Crime Victimization Survey shows that whites commit about 48% of the non-fatal violent crimes and blacks about 35%. When you look at just serious non-fatal violent crimes, whites commit about 41%, blacks 43%. But as mentioned, over the past 5 years, police have killed 39% more unarmed whites than unarmed blacks. There are many more whites killed by police, even though whites account for a similar absolute number of violent offenders. Therefore, the raw data suggests there is a slight anti-white bias in police applications of lethal force. In other words, the police are more likely to use deadly force against whites than against blacks. Is this thing on? In other words, he writes, and I quote, if you measure police shootings against a legitimate benchmark, one that is actually related to how often police need to use lethal force for entirely lawful, ethical, and moral reasons, such as defending themselves from injury, there appears to be a clear anti-white bias, the complete opposite of the entire premise, the entire foundation of Black Lives Matter. Then he talks about a man named Roland Fryer. Roland Fryer is black. He's brilliant. He received a MacArthur Genius Grant. He is one of the youngest tenured professors in the history of Harvard, and Harvard is the oldest college in the country. Roland Fryer is from the inner city. Says himself he's been victimized by racist cops. He just knew the police were engaging in deadly force against blacks just because they were black. He did research, came back and reached the same conclusion as did Mr. Kriegman. The cops were more hesitant, more reluctant to use deadly force against black people than white people. He was so shocked by the findings, he dismissed his entire research staff, hired a new research staff, same results. Now, Mr. Kriegman says it's worth mentioning that Roland Fryer found the police were more likely to use non-deadly force against blacks. And he doesn't know why. I'll tell you why. It's simple. Cops don't want to get this to DEFCON 1. They're trying to avoid using deadly force, so they're using less deadly force more often against blacks because blacks are more likely to resist arrest. This is not complicated. Now, one of the common reactions to all of this is, well, the cops are engaging in over-policing. They're in black areas because they're racist, and that's why they're having more interactions with blacks. Not because of the crime, but because they're just engaging in racism. The data do not support that conclusion. And Kriegman says, look, I'm from Boston. Just take my city. Every year, Boston has dozens of murder victims. Here are the pictures of the victims. Quote, if you look at their faces, you'll quickly notice there are hardly any pictures of whites among Boston's murder victims, despite the fact that there are roughly twice as many whites as blacks in the city. That's because nearly all the murders happen in predominantly black neighborhoods like Dorchester and Roxbury. The reason that police have more confrontations in predominantly black neighborhoods in Boston is because that is where the great bulk of violent crime is occurring. And he points out that murders are a good proxy because other parts of crime, oftentimes people don't report it, or you can argue that there's discretion behind the reporting. Murders are almost always reported. Quote, in plain English, the number of arrests for violent crime is proportional to the number of violent crimes actually committed by each group. Black people are not arrested at a rate disproportionate to the number of crimes committed, and this suggests that black neighborhoods are not, in fact, over-policed. The reason more blacks are arrested for violent crimes is because black neighborhoods suffer more from violent crime. In turn, quote, the primary reason there are more arrests, confrontations with police, and consequently police shootings in predominantly black neighborhoods is because police disproportionately encounter perpetrators of violent crime there. End of quote. Now, as mentioned, this lie against the cops have caused something called the Ferguson effect. After Michael Brown and Ferguson, more recently, the George Floyd effect. And that is, cops are pulling back in the areas where they are most needed. And that results in bad guys knowing it, bad guys committing more crime, bad guys hurting the very people that Black Lives Matter claims they care about. Back to Mr. Kriegman. In 2014, after the shooting of Michael Brown and Ferguson, the BLM movement's anti-police rhetoric and propaganda found a receptive audience. As the police were demonized with falsehoods, their morale declined, and their willingness to engage in proactive policing, such as street stops for suspicious behavior and other forms of policing designed to prevent firearm crimes, plummeted. Cops reported that they were scared or unwilling to confront suspects because the confrontation could escalate into a situation where they would need to use force. Such a situation could turn into a media circus. They could be scapegoated, the careers could be ended, friends and community would cut them off, and possibly they would even be wrongfully convicted and imprisoned. Thousands simply quit. Fewer police stops led to more guns and more criminals on the streets. Murder rates, especially murder rates in low-income black neighborhoods where the police were most reluctant to confront criminal suspects, spiked. And then this data scientist projects exactly how many more murders have occurred as a result of the police pulling back. It's stunning. Relying again on the research of the black Harvard economist Roland Fryer, after an exhaustive statistical analysis, Fryer concluded that not only was there something like the Ferguson effect, but in just the 5 cities he examined, 5 cities, it caused a staggering 900 excess murders and 34,000 excess felonies that would not have otherwise occurred. Now, as mentioned, that was just 5 cities. There's more. The growing consensus in the field of criminology that a decline in proactive policing is resulting in drastic increase in murders is so substantial that even left-wing outlets like CNN are beginning to recognize it. Quote, regardless of whether you call it the Ferguson effect or the Minneapolis effect, or as I say, the George Floyd effect, if you add up the estimates of murders from the different studies in various cities and time periods, you get something in the neighborhood of 2,500 additional murders on the lowest end, but possibly well over 10,000 on the highest end.
Damn!
Get this. Quote, it would take roughly 140 years for police to shoot as many unarmed black people as have been murdered as a result of the BLM falsehoods in just the past few years. But he writes, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Consider this. BLM falsehoods have inflicted the following on black communities. For each victim murdered by criminals, there are dozens of lives derailed, hundreds of children traumatized. Perhaps even greater than the deaths and the trauma that result directly from BLM falsehoods is the damage done by drawing away from the real solutions to the approximately 8,000 black people murdered annually. That's almost half of the nation's total, again, from just 13% of the population. Now, why don't people know this? Why don't people understand this? It's real simple. Ignorance. And he says, for example, people who describe themselves as very liberal think the following. More than 50% believe law enforcement killed 1,000 or more unarmed black men in 2019. Nearly 8% of self-described very liberal people believe the police killed more than 10,000. According to the Washington Post, the real numbers of unarmed black men shot and killed by the police in 2019 was 11.
Just a bit outside.
I repeat, 11. 50% of self-described very liberal people believe the police killed 1,000, and nearly 8% believe the police killed 10,000. I repeat, the number in 2019 was 11. And Mr. Kriegman writes this: "It is impossible to reason intelligently when your beliefs about the relevant facts are so completely divorced from reality." And he explores, why is it the media are so misled about all of this? And his conclusion is pretty staggering. Maybe it's just because so few of the key media owners, editors, and journalists were the ones at risk of being murdered as a result of those falsehoods. They are mostly wealthy and mostly white, living far from the impacted communities. In other words, they don't have to endure the consequences of their ignorance. They publish a story about how the police are mowing down black people, they get in their cars, and they drive to Bel Air, high gated fences, private security. They probably have a gun in the credenza next to their bed. They're not going to be worried about all of this. The crime takes place in the inner city. They don't live in the inner city, so the results of their ridiculous, bad reporting do not come back to haunt them. Now, as mentioned, this data scientist published his data, was asked to come into human resources to repent, to reform, to retract. He refused. He got fired. As Ben Shapiro once said, facts don't care about your feelings. I'm Larry Elder, and this has been the Larry Elder Show for Epic Times. I will see you next time.